My name is Tinashe Sarura. I want to take you through my presentation of jurisprudence, which is called Adjudication of Political Questions in Zimbabwe, which are being coordinated with Mr. Kosana Makoto. So I want you to relax and enjoy the presentation. So I want to take you on the historical overview of the doctrine of political questions. The doctrine is aptly explained and captured in the case of United Democratic Movement versus Speaker of the National Assembly and others. Within the following plan, the doctrine is a result of how the separation of powers works in practice and generally speaking, stipulate that some constitutional issues are constitutionally delegated to the elected branches of government for decision making. As a result, because doing so interferes with the duties of the elected institutions of government, such problems are not justified. As a result, because doing so interferes with the duties of the elected institutions of government, such problems are not justiciable and must be left unresolved by the judiciary. The fundamental idea is that such issues must be resolved through political channels. The same account of explanation the same account of explanation is also being found and buttressed in the case of economic freedom fighters and Speaker of National Assembly and others. It is clear from the foregoing that the theory pertains to constitutional questions of issues that call for non-legal resolutions and demand that courts refrain from deciding such political matters, be decided by other branches of government, such as the executive or legislature, are not the purview of the courts. The idea was first articulated in Madbury and Madison, in which the court declared that the idea was first articulated in Marbury versus Madison, in which the court declared that the separation of powers principle requires specific questions to be answered. It is justiciable since deciding on those issues would reflect on the powers of the political branches. While the Marbury case idea was first articulated in Marbury versus Madison, in which the court declared that the separation of powers principle requires specific questions to be answered. It is unjustifiable since deciding on those issues would infringe on the powers of the political branches. While the Marbury case asserted the power of judicial review, it is also acknowledged in its limitations, stating that the province of the court is solely to decide on the rights of individuals, not to inquire how the executive or executive officers perform over which they have discretion. Questions of a political nature or which are governed by the Constitution and the laws submitted to the executive can never be made in this court. Furthermore, the court made an important observation that when office bearers are appointed by the executive to assist in carrying out his constitutional duties, whatever opinion may be entertained of the manner in which executive discretion may be used, there still exists and can exist no power to control that discretion. The subjects are political, and because they have been entrusted to the administration, the executive's judgment is final. The actions of such an official as an office are never subject to scrutiny by the courts. The presiding reasoning and holding from Marbury gave birth to what became known as the political question doctrine in later years. It is evident that the doctrine was firstly originated in the United States of America, as evident in the Marbury Court. This doctrine is premised on principle of separation of powers, which is the cornerstone of the constitutional supremacy. The court went on to distinguish between this decision. The Marbury Court authorized the court to dismiss lawsuits if the text, structure, or philosophy of the Constitution indicate that an issue should be decided by an elected arm of government. Based on this articulation, Marbury identified a clear distinction between legal matters that must be decided by the judiciary and political questions that must be resolved by the political branches between the legal questions and the judiciary might decide. On with the general overview of the political questions doctrine, the political questions that the court must allow the political branch to remedy or resolve. This entails that the judicial authority is encompassing the resolution of any dispute that can be resolved by the application of the law. Turning to the purpose of the doctrine, it is stipulated in the case of Lane versus Atberton, where the court had this to say: the benefit and purpose of the political question doctrine is to preserve the principle of separation of power and minimize claims that have the potential to undermine this principle. Furthermore, the doctrine serves to prevent the court from intruding or suppressing of certain policies, choices, and judgments that are constitutionally committed to the executive or legislative branches to resolve it.
2.
Moving on to the application of the political question doctrine in Zimbabwe. The legal literature also reveals that modern application of the doctrine in the constitutional jurisprudence include countries like Ghana, Uganda, Nigeria, as well as Zimbabwe. While the doctrine exists and recognized in the South African and Zimbabwean jurisdiction, the constitutional courts should articulate and develop into clear doctrine, taking into account lessons from those countries. In the case of Movin Kufa and another and the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe, according to the court, reference is made to the political question doctrine, which, while recognized in the United States, is not recognized in this jurisdiction. This demonstrates the idea is not universally accepted by the Zimbabwean courts. I am of the opinion that once a political matter is stated into the constitution, it becomes justiciable. And the court continued. However, any remedy imposed by the court must take into account any negative implications of such remedy on the current political order. Furthermore, in the case of Innocent Gonis and another versus the President of Zimbabwe and others, the Constitutional Court had this to say: in any event, only the Constitutional Court can intrude into the domain of Parliament, as was held Pengogo J in the case of Doctors for Life International versus Speaker of National Assembly, where the court remarked as follows: a review by a court of whether Parliament is complied with its obligations under Section 72, subsection 1, subsection A, calls upon a court to intrude into the domain of principal legislative organ of the state. Under our constitution, this intrusion is reserved for this court only. Through a comparative lens analysis, the current application of the doctrine both in South Africa and Zimbabwe is not firmly embraced and developed is opposed to the above cited countries. To further on this case, in the case of my company Private Limited and others versus Republic of Zimbabwe, the tribunal held that the Zimbabwean government violated the organization treaty by denying access to the courts and engaging in racial discrimination. While the tribunal appears to have reached the right conclusion, its reasoning could have been more persuasive of wider significance is the fact that the tribunal established itself as a forum that can provide relief for human rights violations. Its finding that human rights are justiciable and a truth is notable. In the case of Francis Mary Bowen versus Minister of Lands, in the case of Francis Mary Boer and the Minister of Lands and Agriculture, the very best farmers whose farm were seized by the government, the High Court judge dismissed the case. The High Court had no authority to determine the application starting the instrument. The court had not coming into the conclusion that the potential availability of the remedy of compulsion does not distract from the right of a subject of the state to seek more appropriate relief. The High Court refused to hear out because it was a political matter. They argued that it was the duty of the legislature. To further on, in the case of Mbizo Mawarire versus Robert Mugabe and in his official capacity and four others, the Constitutional Court tackled the question of the validity of the elections held in Zimbabwe on July 31, 2013. The applicant alleged an infringement of his constitutional rights caused by the failure of the first respondent to co-elections within the life of parliament. The first respondent took the view that elections had to be called within 4 months before the expiration of the life of parliament. The second and the fourth respondent took the view that elections would lawfully be called up to 4 months after the dissolution of parliament. In a political climate where some took the view that judgments were granted in order to legitimize and further propagate the views of the executive, the decision of the Constitutional Court in this matter was eagerly anticipated. In this case, note the parties' arguments and critique the decision of the judges of the Constitutional Court, coming to the conclusion that the sitting judges grasped the proper interpretation of the Constitution, that the judiciaries in Africa and Zimbabwe at large would recognize their duty to promote a fair and even a political playing field. It is critical for the judiciary to appreciate the importance of the justifiable decision making, particularly in high contest cases that define important political and democratic process in the country. In the case of Mawezenge versus Minister of Justice, the background to this case was that Zimbabwe in 2013 adopted a new constitution. Through Section 232, subsection A, the constitution established the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission as one of the independent commissions. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is one of the independent commissions and it gives an inclusive mandate to administer all elections into public office. The Constitution guarantees SEC independence by stating the following in Section 235. The independent commissions independent, are not subject to the direction or control of anyone, must exercise their functions without fear of or prejudice, although they are accountable to Parliament for the efficient performance of their function. The central The independent commissions are independent, are not subject to the direction or control of anyone, must exercise their functions without fear or favor or prejudice, although they are accountable to Parliament for the efficient performance of their function. The central legal question to be determined by the court was whether the power given to the minister to approve regulations was constitutionally valid in light of the constitutional guarantee of the Independence Election Management Board. The approach was taken by the court and this decision seemed to be contrary to the Constitution. In Section 196, subsection 6 of the Electoral Act is so ambiguous that it admits only one logical meaning. The Election Management Board will not promulgate regulations if the minister does not approve the draft submitted to him. There seems no logical legal reason why the court rejected this clear interpretation. Arguably, there was a political reason to do so. If the court had accepted this, the interpretation would have left it with no choice but to strike this provision. And the political consequence would be such that the governing party would lose control over the Electoral Commission's regulation. The court failed to enforce the constitution and protect the independence of the election management body. Instead, it appears that the court allowed the constitution to be violated in order to allow the ruling party to maintain control over the election body. Furthermore, in the case of Liberal Democrat versus Republic of Zimbabwe, the case was decided upon at the backdrop of military action against the then President Robert Mugabe's government. The question was of whether or not the military deployment was constitutionally valid depended on one interpretation of Section 213 of the Constitution, which provides as follows. Subject to this Constitution, only the President, as Commander in Chief of the Defense Forces, has the power to authorize the deployment of the Defense Forces or has the power to determine the operational use of the Defense Forces. The court seems to have made a strategic decision to avoid engaging in procedural avoidance, avoiding to deal with legal questions brought before it in order to avoid political risk. In the case of State versus Monzura, the background to this case the background to this case is that a senior in the case of State versus Douglas Dinofire Monzor, the background to this case is that a senior opposition politician has been charged for insulting and undermining the authority of the president in contravention of Section 33.2 of the Criminal Law Code. The Constitutional Court refused to directly adjudicate on that question. Instead, it decided that the appropriate is to first assess whether, in this particular case, Mr. Monzoret actually committed a crime, which he was alleged to have committed. If so, then the court would determine the constitutional question tendered before it. It was decided under condition that it made politically sensitive. The court adopted this approach in order to avoid having to determine the constitutionality of the impugnment criminal law. If it, the court had adopted a different approach, it would have been forced to review the constitutionality of the law. The legal jurisprudence of the doctrine is that it upholds, preserves the principle of separation of powers, in which is the cornerstone of any constitutional democratic state. In most constitutional democracies, political disputes or contests are likely end up in the courts. When this happens, judicial overreach can reasonably be perceived and judicial independence jeopardized. For instance, in the case of Nelson Chamisa versus Emerson Mnangagwa, the judicial independence was alleged compromise when the judicial was called for to resolve the election dispute in 2010. This was a pure political question which was to be resolved through political processes, not by the application of law. One thing to say they should be committee among the pillars, and it is another to suggest that courts should develop canon to guide them in the adjudication of political questions. Furthermore, in the case of Mazimbuku, leader of the opposition in the National Assembly, versus Sisulu MP, Speaker of the National Assembly, there is a threat to judicial independence when the judiciary is drawn in to resolve political questions that are beyond its competence or jurisdiction. He further said that an overreach of the powers of judges, their intrusion into issues which are beyond their competence or intended jurisdiction, which has been deliberately and carefully constructed legally so as to ensure that other arms of the state to deal with these matters can only result in jeopardy for our constitutional democracy. In the case of MDC Alliance versus MDCT, the judgment concerns the leadership dispute in the movement for democratic change. The Supreme Court held that the decision of the High Court that there was illegalities in both instances. The judiciary perceived to be conflicting with the ruling party interest due to the fact that succession in politics is often less about legalities than political strategy. In the Chilonga case, which is Mr. Chuku versus Minister of Lands and Mines and Agriculture, the government the Chilonga case, the government issued statutory instrument that abstracts communal lands. The land was occupied by the Chilonga people since colonial era. The Chilonga people faced eviction to pay way for the proposed irrigation scheme. The High Court invoked the political doctrine. It was held that the land in question is a political question, which would be left for the arms of the government to determine. In simpler terms, the court said that the case cannot be determined by the law and the courts, rather, politics should determine. Sometimes politics should speak first, then the law follows. The difficult that confronts democracies is how to jurisprudentially resolve the political question that end up in the courts while at the same time preserve the separation of powers and rule of law. Furthermore, the doctrine is an appropriate legal mechanism that limits the concept of judicial review, where the doctrine limits judicial intrusion in certain areas of specialization with other arms of government. The underlying theme is that such questions must find a resolution in the political process. To conclude, it is apparent that the doctrine is very important in constitutional democracies, where the principle of separation of powers is fundamental. It is also a legal mechanism that limits the concept of judicial review, where the courts are empowered to review the functions of other two arms of the government. In other hands, the doctrine can be viewed as a battling god.
two, two,
In conclusion, it is apparent that the doctrine is very important in constitutional democracies, where the principle of separation of powers is fundamental. It is also legal mechanism that limits the concept of judicial review, where the courts are empowered to review the functions of other two arms of the government. In other hands, the doctrine can be viewed as a bad legal tool which protects the conduct of other two arms of government, being non-justifiable and prone to be misused by politicians. Yet the doctrine is to a large extent is retrogressive in nature because of constitutional supremacy, as compared to the old regime of parliamentary sovereignty. Therefore, I, international disclosure Sarah, I give the view that Zimbabwe jurisprudence does not embrace the doctrine of political questions. It was held in the case discussed above. A case to notice the Gufa versus Mugabe, where Justice Jewish held that Zimbabwe does not embrace the political doctrine. The legal framework or constitutional framework entails that we have three arms of government, which is an ideal framework to adopt the doctrine. There appear to be a clear indication by the framework that practical judicial stand when dealing with matters. It must not be the legal shield that limits the concept of judicial review and ethics, such that courts are to review the conduct of other arms of the government for checks and balances. The doctrine can be a legal tool which can arbitrarily be used by politicians to circumvent or thwart the judicial scrutiny. So, this marks the end of my presentation. I'm International Jurisprudence Sarora. My presentation was Adjudication of Political Questions in Zimbabwe. Thanks.
one.
Thanks for tuning in. This marks the end of my presentation. My name is Tinashala Dusim Sarurwa. I was presenting on adjudication of political questions in Zimbabwe. I'm being coordinated by Mr. Mkosana Maposa. Thank you. Bye for now.